Hello and welcome to Resistance United Great Britain here on Telegram. Tonight we have Mr. William Gairdner, who is going to talk about his book, The Book of Absolutes, on the subject of objective truth versus relativism. If you have any questions or comment, please raise your hand to let us know, and one of the hosts here will allow the question to be asked at the most appropriate time. William, thank you as usual for coming again. This is very, very nice of you, and we always appreciate that. Um,
Thank you for
so
having
that's lovely. So yeah, the show is yours. Please go ahead and educate us.
me. Okay, well, maybe I should review just a little bit what we talked about in the first episode, which is here on this site, and it's on my personal website. Uh, Basically, I was reviewing the subject matter of modern relativism by reaching back into the past and trying to explain as well as I could where it came from. And when I first began studying this matter, I was surprised that there was such a vigorous debate over 2,500 years ago, thereabouts, between the ancients, philosophers like Aristotle, philosophers like Plato, Protagoras, and so on, debated this thing roundly and, in my opinion, put it to bed. In fact, I personally think that Aristotle's arguments against Protagoras were so strong that Protagoras just, figuratively speaking, he just slunk away and hid in the corner for the rest of time. And so did anybody who took his position, which is that man is the measure of all things. And Aristotle had a good time with this. I've actually just been reading that part of his book called Metaphysics again, where he says, and I'm paraphrasing, that what it boils down to is that if you think a man is a ship, it's sufficient to think he's a ship to make him a ship. Or if you think he's not a ship, suddenly he's not a ship, and so on. And Aristotle basically laughed all the relativists out of town with his arguments. But for some reason, it has arisen again and again throughout human history. And our period right now happens to be one of those in which it has had a really vigorous rerun, so to speak. Not without opposition, I have to say, such as from people like me, but it's had a vigorous rerun over the last 50 years in particular. When I'm asked to speculate on why that might be, one of the reasons I come up with repeatedly is that the Second World War and all the devastation surrounding those events blew such a hole in modern philosophical and moral confidence, especially with the young, that I think the view was that there can't be any truth. There can't be any consistent right and wrong. Obviously, it's just something that people make up, and that's why the world's fallen apart and why we're blowing each other up with atom bombs and machine guns and all the rest of it. I mean, that wasn't a bad reason when you think about it, because people who grew up after World War II and came into some consciousness of it were understandably devastated when it came to an adult asking them, "What are your beliefs?" Well, obviously, they would say, typically, "I don't believe in God." How could there be a God who would allow such horrible things to happen? You know, everyone's been through that logic in their own lives, and it is hard to come up with an answer to those things. So I think modern relativism, I'm trying to say, was given a real kick down the road by the actual political and military events, which began well, which took place almost all through the 20th century. I mean, the 20th century was probably one of the most devastating of all time in terms of human beings killing each other. There's an interesting book by a Professor Rudolf Rummel from the University of Hawaii. It's called Death by Government.
Democide, yeah?
Yeah, I guess the nickname was Democide, but I think the title of the book was Death by Government, wasn't it? I can't quite remember.
Yeah. Yes, you're right.
Anyway, it's a very detailed book, and one of the few places you can go to where you can find someone's made a pretty aggressive effort to pull the numbers together. And when he pulls the numbers together, he asks you this question. And I often ask people that question because they've never thought about it and don't know what to say. His question was, how many military combatants do you think were killed in the 20th century? By that, he means people who were in uniform fighting for their various armies, no matter which war. Of all the wars and battles of the 20th century, how many military combatants were killed? People sometimes get pretty close, but sometimes not. And they the number in his book is something like 50 million military combatants were killed in the 20th century. That's a huge number. But then he says, how many human beings do you think were killed by their own governments in the 20th century? He's talking about the communist slaughters, the Nazi slaughters, the red communist slaughters in the Far East, and Korean slaughters, and all that kind of stuff put together. And the number is a shocking 150 million. And he thinks that's low. He said that's just the number that he was able to verify. He figures the number may be actually more upwards of 250 or 300 million people killed by their own governments. I mean, so the message you get here is that government is bad for your health. I often say that, and people say, why? Why do you say that? Because a lot of people are walking around with the notion that government is doing mostly good things for you. And there are some good things that it does, like help to protect you against enemies and things like that. But the notion that governments of the world in the 20th century liquidated, I'm talking about by, shooting, gassing, starving, bludgeoning, God knows what, all those people. It creates a suspicion of the whole idea of government in general, and it should. And so anyway, I got off track a little bit there, but what I was trying to do was to review the whole business of relativism and where that came from. And in the 20th century, I think that gave it a big shot in the arm. There is no moral absolute. There can't be, or we wouldn't have had these killings and these disasters. So that's the kind of foundation, I think, of the unsettled feeling that people have about whether or not there's any truth. Well, I thought this kind of went too far because I think there is truth. And the object of writing my book of absolutes, and I'm just going to hold it up again for your viewers. The reason I wrote the book was because I got tired of people arguing that it's true for you, but not true for me. And I'll just repeat what I always say, which is it can't be true and false at the same time. That's an Aristotelian point, by the way, because he made a lot of headway with the argument that two things cannot be true and false at the same time and in the same way, period. And so I was just using that argument to rebut this idea that is true for you, but not true for me. And that led to this book. And that led to a review of the history of relativism, where it came from and what it is, how it is fundamentally self-defeating, because if you make a statement, for example, like Nietzsche famously made, that there are no facts, only interpretations, that itself is a self-defeating statement, because if there are no facts, then that's not a fact, is it? So he ends up in a kind of a circle here where he defeats himself with his own argument. At any rate, in the book, I trot out the arguments for relativism and then the arguments against it, and there are many. So I encourage people to get the book and enjoy that little feast of argumentation. And then we went through some of the early chapters about the constants of nature, for example, which has interested me for some time. There you're basically dealing with fundamental physics and the findings of the constants of nature in physics. It's interesting. Last week, one of my relatives was over for dinner and asked me about, is there life in other planets somewhere in the universe and that kind of stuff. And there's always speculation about that. So we had the discussion again. And I said, well, if you look at the constants of nature and what is required to have an environment like the Earth, which is hospitable to biological life, you're talking about a very, very fine structured reality. The image one of the physicists gave that I liked, he said, those organs in the church, they have 2 or 3 levels of keys that you play, and they have pedals, and they have what they call stops on the side of the organ where you pull them in and out to get various effects out of the organ pipes. I mean, let's say there's about 75 of those devices to modify the sound that you're making. He said, well, that's about the same idea as the constants of nature in physics. If the mass of the electron was 1 iota different than it is, if gravity were just a tiny bit different than it is, and so on and so on. And he went through this for all the constants of nature, Planck's constant and all the rest. I mean, I've got them laid out in the book here because I'm not a physicist. I just had to learn all this myself. If you think of those devices on the organ as one of those physical constants, each of them, all you have to do is push one pedal down or just pull one of those stops out a little bit, and we wouldn't be here. Like the ability of this environment to host and generate human life, biological life would not be here. And so my answer to my relative was, it's a question of probability. The so-called Goldilocks zone for planets that we think are zooming around other stars. Do the 75 constants of nature that are absolutely essential for the creation and continuation of biological life exist in those places? So far, we haven't found any, not even close. So anyway, I think your listeners will enjoy the chapter on the constants of nature. And then I move into the question of biology. And I mentioned last time, because we're moving on now in the book, that it's interesting that in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was biologists who were generally the more open to ideas about creation and the why and wherefore of life on Earth and so on. And it was the physicists who were adamant about, this is what physics is. Basically, I suppose, because of the Newtonian influence. Because, Newton really came up with some of the first constants of nature in physics, like the law of gravity and first and second law of, thermodynamics and all that kind of thing. But now it's a little bit different. There are lots of physicists now who are asking themselves if there isn't some kind of reality out there of a Platonic nature, and that when we do physics, is it possible that we're actually discovering these constants of nature? We're not inventing them. We're discovering them. And I think as one philosopher, I'm sorry, his name escapes me. He was a famous atheist for decades, but he wrote a book a few years ago in which he basically argued that human consciousness was the object of the universe. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here now to observe it, which is what we're doing. In other words, his logical argument was all the elements necessary for the creation of an observing human consciousness had to be there in the beginning, or they wouldn't be here now. So this is the kind of thinking that you're getting more and more increasingly from modern physicists. And it's the biologists who are, laying down the law, this is the way things are, and these are the laws of biology and all the rest of it. At any rate, this got me into my chapter, which I call Hardwired, in the Book of Absolutes. And if your listeners are interested, I'd like to just rest for a moment on the business of brain sex, which is a name that I pulled from a book I relied on, which discusses the differences between the male and the female human brain. And I thought it was very, very interesting book, and that was part of my research resource for this chapter. And I'll preface my brief remarks by the comment one of the writers made that boys and girls are just as different above the neck as they are below. Whoa, saying that today, people will stare at you, especially if you're anywhere near a university where they're all pretending that gender doesn't matter and you can choose your gender and all that kind of stuff, and your pronouns, and the sex you were born with has nothing to do with who you are or what you are as a human being or how you behave. That turns out not to be true. It turns out that there are lots of brain sex differences between males and females, some of which are quite interesting. And there's researchers all over the world who are more or less coming up to these same conclusions, whether they get at them through language studies, through CT scans, PET scans, or brain scans and all that kind of thing or not. There's experiments taking place all over which demonstrate these differences. So I'm just going to mention a few, which may seem innocent at first, but they are differences. For example, there are difference in the levels of sense awareness between boys and girls starting at a very young age. Differences in verbal abilities, math abilities, spatial abilities, both imaginal and actual, throwing and targeting skills, fine motor skills, rotational and directional skills, skills in games like chess, which tends to have a spatial emphasis, and Scrabble, which tends to have the verbal emphasis. Most people have played those games and will know what I'm talking about. And then problem-solving psychology, which differs in the way boys and girls, males and females, go about problem solving. So there are gendered senses. For example, infant girls, but not infant boys, distinguish a baby's cry from other general sounds at a very, very young age. Baby boys tend to prefer objects to people. And then girls and language. Girls develop language fluency and verbal memory earlier than boys, and they process such information faster, which is a difference observed by all researchers. When it comes to play differences, girls are less rule-bound and boys are more so. Boys need rules to tell them whether they are winning or not. Their pre-adolescent play is often what they call rank-related. They need to know where they stand. The girls tend to turn away from that kind of play. They don't want ranks or to be, ordered good, better, best at something, at least among themselves. And then, of course, there are big aggression differences, which is probably the most famous one, mostly hormonally dictated, I suppose. From birth, boys are more aggressive, competitive, and self-assertive than girls. perhaps the most common finding worldwide, even by feminist researchers who were the first ones I read. Eleanor Maccabee and Carol Jacklin from Stanford wrote a book in the 70s called The Psychology of Sex Differences, in which they actually set out to prove that there weren't any. But by the end of their study, which reviewed about, I don't know, 500 or 600, independent studies, this was like a meta study, they gave up. And they basically said, and I'm quoting actually some of the differences that they landed on. Human cognitive patterns, and I'll wrap up on this here. Human cognitive patterns and their related brain organization are apparently permanently influenced by physiological events that take place by the fourth fetal month. Boys and girls' brains differ. Highly sophisticated atomic brain imaging at Yale University School of Medicine has shown that cognitive tasks presented to both sexes tend to be localized in the frontal gyrus of both hemispheres of the female brain, but in the same area in only one dominant hemisphere of the male brain. Well, it goes on like this. Brain metabolism, the differences in the degrees of violence that are, when you look at crime statistics, by the way, and there's a wonderful book on all that by Wilson called Crime and Human Nature. Boy, if you want to see sex differences between the genders when it comes to crime, that book is an eyeful and an earful for sure. Anyway, I just wanted to share some of that with your visitors here to say that this flies in the face of modern, actually contemporary, very contemporary ideology, where people like Jordan Peterson, who got his start when he got bullied at the University of Toronto for refusing to use the pronouns that some guy walked up to him and said he wanted to be called she or z or whatever it was, and he refused. He said, no one can force me to use pronouns that I think are bizarre or don't want to use. And the kid objected, and well, I consider myself a girl. And he said, well, I don't. And why should I refer to you as a girl if you're obviously a boy? Because if you referred to yourself as Jesus Christ or Napoleon, I wouldn't pray to you or call you Louis Napoleon or whatever.
William, I think that Jordan Peterson's main objection was that the Canadian government was trying to pass a law forcing people to actually accept these new terms and force Jordan Peterson in order not to hurt the feelings of that she or she or whatever. This was his objection, that it shouldn't become a law because that's the beginning or the end of free speech.
Yes, it is. And by the way, free speech itself is an interesting topic. I know your group is probably very interested in it. And I'm a defender myself, of course, but people raise their eyebrows when I say there's never really been free speech anywhere in the world ever, except maybe astronauts on the moon when they went out for a walk and nobody could hear them. Free speech has never existed, not in the sense that people really mean, say whatever you want, wherever you want, however you want. It's always I call it an undecidable. In fact, freedom itself, human liberty is an undecidable. It's always contextual. I have never read a definition of liberty which didn't have holes in it. And the reason is human beings exist in social contexts. They always have and they always will. And in fact, I'm very much a supporter of liberty, and I think it's hard done by most of the time. But that's no reason to turn away from facing what it actually is or is not. So a few years ago, I wrote an article for a newspaper called "There Can Be No Morality on the Moon." And it's somewhat equivalent to this topic, the question of liberty. And my argument was that when you're on the moon, unless you consider God to be keeping company with you, which is fair enough, you can't be moral or immoral, because you can't be immoral or moral to yourself. And there's no one else you can affect. So morality doesn't exist on the moon if you're alone there. You know, it's a human contextual reality, and so is liberty, and that's why I say it's an undecidable. Much as we want to protest and carry flags and say we want to be free, and I wrote an article about this actually, which I encourage your listeners to go read. It's on my website. It's called 6 Kinds of Freedom. And in it, I try to distinguish between, first of all, freedom and liberty, because these two words are not always the same. For example, I say the man in jail is still free, but he has no liberty. It's a very different use of the term. And that's because the man in jail, for example, he can decide to squeal on his buddy outside and get the police to go pick him up, or he can shut up. He has these kinds of choices to make. He's very free that way. But as I say, he has no liberty. And if he breaks out of jail, the first thing you'll hear on the radio is that he's at liberty. That's the way we use these terms. But so in a very real sense, human beings can't help being free in terms of what I call internal freedom. You know, internal freedom is your thinking and the moral positions that you choose with respect to your own actions. But not all concepts of freedom are the same. For example, the ancients had a very strict and, I think, clear definition of freedom. What they said was freedom, to be free, was not to be a slave. Now, in modern times, we get close to that when we say freedom means not to be subject to the arbitrary rule of another, which could be a government or a master or a boss or whoever. If it's arbitrary rule, it's a bad thing. And that, by the way, was the concept of freedom that the founders of America and Canada and other parts of the world had in the 17th and 18th centuries. They would have laughed at our John Stuart Mill definition of liberty, which is spelled out in his little book on liberty. And I think we discussed this before. It's a subject that's very top of mind for me because Mill was a smart dude, but not as smart as everybody thinks he was, because that little book was only about 60 or 70 pages and had 5 parts. And the first part was where he talks about his harm principle. It basically boils down to you should be able to do whatever you want as long as you don't harm someone else. But even interfering with someone else's freedom to save them from themselves or to stop them from jumping off a bridge and all that is ruled out. You have no obligation to do that and so on. So the harm principle is basically at the root of modern libertarian thinking. Now, I began as a libertarian. You know, I read all the classic sort of libertarian texts. I was very fired up about it. And then I slowly began to see it as what I call a simple faith. And that is because it's not sufficient to behave in a way that simply doesn't harm someone else. How you ought to behave is in a way that creates the good society, the good community, and you, the good you. It's not enough simply to say, I want to do whatever I want without harming some other guy. This whole business of being allowed to swing your fist, and that's a right that you have, which ends at my nose. Well, that's also a ridiculous statement. Nobody can imagine walking around the local mall with a whole bunch of people swinging their fists at them and just pulling up short of their nose. That would be a terrible world. You know, I know it's a metaphor, but what I'm getting at is that I think we need some more sophisticated insights into the notion of liberty itself. And that probably goes to the heart of this group and what it's about too. And it goes to the heart of this whole COVID thing and the directives of these states that are pushing us around now for our own good and all that sort of thing. But I think we need to sophisticate the public discussion, and I think the libertarian view of liberty is inadequate to
William,
our needs.
I would like to ask a question, please. I think I'm confused myself now. Are you basically saying that objective truth, sorry, objective moral behavior is only in the context of human culture?
Well, I think I
Because
have to throw. I think I have to. I heard you. I think I have to throw the question back at you. Do you think it? Do you think that objective moral behavior means anything if you're alone on the moon?
well, I think it's obviously not practical to do anything that may be considered moral, but I think that morality has to be extracted from nature, the existence of a logical, reasonable world, total existence. I'm sorry for my English. I will try to articulate myself better.
No,
Um,
you speak great English.
Thank you. So I always thought that it's always there, even in the absence of man, and it's up to the people to discover that universal objective truth, and then to try to apply it in our life. So obviously, if you are completely alone in the moon, there is no practical need to do that. But as soon as you have two people on the moon, then you have to connect to something higher, which is always there, that deeper understanding, and then you have to apply it in your own life. So my point is, does it exist if people don't exist?
Well, that's a philosophical question. I don't think anyone's ever answered. I'm not smart enough to answer it. You're asking me if morality exists as a Platonic reality, like a form,
Yes.
independent of the objective world. I think a lot of natural law theorists would say yes, it does. Just like two plus two equals four exists as a mathematical reality, whether or not we have two apples, two plus two apples.
Hmm.
It exists as a Platonic ideal. And it's interesting, your question, because I bought a book about great mathematicians some time ago. It was just one of these coffee table books, had a nice picture of about 50 of these amazing mathematicians and physicists and all that. And, and then a little paragraph beside each picture on what they believed. And I would say 50% of those great mathematicians and physicists said outright that they were Platonists, that there's a world of mathematical realities and physical realities, but very abstract nature, which kind of runs things, runs the universe, and we are discovering them. We're not inventing them. No one created two plus two equals four. It's there as a eternal truth in some kind of heaven of ideas. Now, by the way, this I don't know if you want this digression here, but this gets down to the argument that Aristotle had with Plato, and which is still going on because Plato argued that, I think, like you are doing, that there is some world of Platonic forms, some reality out there, of which on Earth we have only degraded manifestations, degraded because they're subject to change.
Yeah,
They do not stay. They do not
but
stay the
William,
same.
I'm not sure that I'm claiming that there is like a Platonic realm outside of, let's say, the natural world. I think that we can conclude if we are observing the orderly universe, and I think the universe is logical and consistent. So maybe we can extract some principles from that and turn it into a moral law that we can follow. And if we don't follow it, eventually there will be consequences. I think it's observable in nature and not something external to us like Plato is offering. But again, I'm not smart enough to even make my own argument. I apologize.
You're making it. I'm not sure I understand what that reality would be if it's not a Platonic form.
1 second. Maybe JD here can help me. JD, are you here? Maybe you can comment on that. I have the feeling you can help. No, I guess he's not here. Yeah. Yes, he's here. 1 second, William.
Hey guys, yeah, I'm here. I'm listening. I'm working on my truck, and I'm actually just kind of
Oh,
half listening. So,
we can't hear you properly. You're very quiet.
okay, I'll pass.
Okay, thank you.
Too bad.
William, let's continue, please. I apologize for the distraction.
No, that's okay. I think it's very interesting. These questions and what you have said interest me a lot. In fact, those are the kind of things I spend a lot of time thinking about these days. But it comes down to the natural law too, which we spoke about a little bit last time. And people who defend the natural law, I think, would say what you just said, that the natural law, like morality, because law is a reflection of a moral structure, after all, exists in some kind of zone or heaven of ideas, if you like. And, we pull down the index card. And when the time comes up, and that's why at the Nuremberg trials, the judges who had been raised only on human positive law and who probably had been discouraged from any support of or belief in natural law, because that's the training they got, and that's what it's like mostly today. They reverted to natural law concepts in order to hang the Nazi criminals, because they couldn't do it on the basis of natural law, because some of the greatest, on positive law, because some of the greatest positive law thinkers like Hans Kelsen had basically argued that a law is a law is a law, as long as it's duly made, duly constituted by a duly sovereign body. Then the guy was just following orders, the law. And so you can't hang him. And the judges basically said what Aquinas said, which is that an unjust law is not a law. But even Aquinas could have polished that a little bit and said, it may be called a law, but it has no ability to command moral allegiance from the people because it's unjust. And that's why he said it's not a law. And that's what the court in Nuremberg said, to convict those people and hang them for their war crimes. Otherwise, they had no grounds to do it, none whatsoever. Anyway, there's a lot more in this book, and I don't know if you want me to keep going here.
Yes.
But the second chapter on law here is called Natural Law at Work in the World. And I can't take everybody through it. In fact, I have to tell you, it's not like I go through this book every day. It was written published in 2008. Took a lot of work to create it. And honestly, I can hardly believe how much information there is in it about these subjects. I certainly couldn't do it again. It took that much work. But suffice to say that in the second chapter on the natural law, it's called The Natural Law at Work in the World. It's about international law. And one of the great mysteries, which in a way is a response to your earlier statement, one of the great mysteries is why it is that so many nations who have never had intercourse at all, any kind of contact with each other, nevertheless pretty much agree on what the international law is with respect to the law of nations and the behavior of foreigners with each other. So how did that happen? Where did that come from? They weren't on the moon, but they weren't with those people either. But when they start comparing their notes on what kind of law should govern international relations, it's pretty much what Aquinas came up with in the 13th century when he formalized these statements. So I think your members here will enjoy that chapter too. And perhaps now I should move on a little bit to talk about the last half of this book, which really, the last part of the last half ends with complex analyses of language. And the first part of the last half talks about what preceded that in the thinking of various European thinkers in particular, especially the German Romantic thinkers of the 18th and 19th centuries, and how the German Romantic philosophy, which eventually surfaced as Nazism Germany, and it bled over into Italy with their fascism. How that kind of thinking was rooted in a particular German concept of natural life, natural history, spontaneous human behavior, and what the Germans, even in the Nazi period, called Blut und Boden, blood and soil. And this kind of thinking and these kind of statements became popular as a form of resistance to what? Well, to reason, to French reason in particular, and French Enlightenment thinking, which led to the French Revolution and all that. So the Germans didn't want French rationalism, and you don't have to go very far back in their history to see them fighting it in the name of Barbarossa and all these legendary figures in German history who were singing the praises of, as I said, blood and soil, German romantic life, naturalness, as opposed to reason. In fact, and then you got it in the operas of Wagner and people like that, Der Meistersinger and Tristan and Isolde and other huge operas celebrating the vitality of the folk and so on. At any rate, you'll find quite a bit of that story in the second half of this book. So that basically led us to the work of Nietzsche and Heidegger in particular. And I mention those two especially because there's a chapter in the book on what I call the French Nietzsche and the French Heidegger, because the most immediate influence on modern relativism in Europe, which came over to America really at a specific date, 1966, at a conference in Johns Hopkins University, when Jacques Derrida basically delivered a bombshell lecture, which galvanized American academic life and turned it in a new direction away from certainties and more in the direction of relativism and relativistic thought. But I guess I have to give your people a bit of the background here with respect to language and language theory, because it was language theory that led to literary and critical theory, which led to political theory, and all the relativism that ran through that. Let me be brief and say that what we used to call grammar, which is what I learned in high school, was rooted in meaning. It was semantic. For example, we said the definition of a noun. What's a noun, sir? Well, a noun is the name of a person, a place, or a thing, right? That's the definition that most of us learned. But then along came something called structural analysis in language studies. Basically, it was an outgrowth of an amazing French thinker who died in, I think, 1913, named Ferdinand de Saussure, who published a book called A Course in General Linguistics, in which he basically said all that semantic stuff that you're learning about how language works, that's all screwed up. Language is a structural reality. It boils down to a kind of code that everybody learns kind of unconsciously as they grow up. And a noun is not the name of a person, place, or thing, because if you use that definition, you have to say to yourself, well, love is not a person, love is not a place, love is not a thing, but we call it a noun. How come, sir? And the teacher doesn't know what to say. So Saussure would basically say instead, look, it's a structural matter. If we have a sentence like the blank ran across the street, he would say whatever fits in that blank is a noun. Okay, it has a structural definition, not a semantic one. Get semantics out of all this. And that led to the study of something called semiotics or semiology, which is the study of sign systems. I don't want to lose anybody here, and I especially don't want to lose myself. But what it boils down to is that what is called a sign plays a role in the way systems work, in the way that a symbol doesn't. For example, the color red can symbolize fire, passion, love, blood, any number of things. But if you come to a traffic light and you see the color red, you better not be thinking about it as a symbol, because you'll probably drive on through it and get hit. In a traffic system, the color red is simply a sign, and it's contrasted with the color green and the color yellow, which have their own functional structural meanings in the code system that we call the traffic system. If you start thinking about those as symbolic realities, you're going to get in trouble, because the sign system won't be helping you at all. Like I said, you get in an accident. So anyway, when people began reading Saussure's work and applying his thinking to the way language is structured and the way language works, they then went from there into whole systems, like how literature works, how drama and theater works, how cultural systems work, and so on. And here's the deal. In order for there to be a sign is comprised of two elements: a signifier, let's say the word yama in Japanese, and the concept that it refers to, which is the mountain. Yama means mountain in Japanese. That's called the signified, and that's just the concept. Now, it may have a real world referent, like Mount Fuji. So then we say, well, there's a signifier and there's a signified, the sign, the signifier and the signified. And then we have the real world referent, which is 75 miles away, Mount Fuji over there. But the signifier is arbitrary. Now, this was the loaded pistol. When structuralism came into modern thinking about language and culture and relativism, the loaded pistol was the idea of arbitrariness. Because why do the Japanese refer to a mountain as Yama, whereas the French called it La Montagne and English call it the mountain, and whatever. Every language has its own signifier for what a mountain is. It's completely arbitrary. That's correct. But what the cultural mavens took a hold of in all of this was that all signs themselves are arbitrary, that they just point to other signs. And that, as Derrida said when he came along, there's nothing outside the text. The whole world is just text. Another modern, or let's call it a postmodern thinker, used the expression the prison house of language. And what he said was basically, we're all trapped in a prison house of language because all signifiers are arbitrary. They really just refer to each other. And that's what Derrida said when he came to Johns Hopkins in 1966. And suddenly all these academics who were actually plowing very stale fields in their various studies, suddenly they had a new lease on life, because they said, oh my God, if he's correct and everything is arbitrary and every sign points just to some other system of signs, boy, this is going to be a field day. I'm going to run off and write another book about this, that kind of thing. So he gave a huge shot in the arm to a lot of bored professors, I think, when he brought that concept along. But he also introduced the radical notion of radical relativism, or what came to be called anti-foundationalism. Now, some of these people happen to be very good writers, very good thinkers, but they just got hooked in this idea that there is no foundation to reality. Stanley Fish in America was a famous Milton a scholar of the poetry of John Milton, but he wrote, I can't remember the name of his book, but he wrote a well-known book on anti-foundationalism, in which you'd be hard-pressed to make arguments against him, because this was a smart dude. But in the long run, these arguments are in fact self-defeating, because as I say in my reference to what Nietzsche said, If you say there's no facts, only interpretations, well then even that is not a fact. So it's self-denying logic that gets entered into by these people. But when you start talking about arbitrariness, nothing outside the text, prison house of language, and by the way, now I'm segueing back to my War Against the Family book. Then you're talking about going into classrooms with children and teaching them what they call MVE, or moral values education. This idea that the children should make up their own set of moral values because there aren't any that we can have confidence in to download into their little minds from parents or churches. Oh, churches, please, that kind of thing, because God doesn't exist and all that. You see, it just opened this kind of study of language, which my book deals with rather intensively, led to the infiltration of radical relativism everywhere, in the schools, in the textbooks, and even in, say, literary studies. Roland Barthes, for example, wrote a book in, I think, 1966 or 1970 called The Death of the Author. And the idea behind the book basically was that the author didn't write the book, he just put his name on it. Who really wrote the book was the culture. He was just the amanuensis, or whatever the term is, through whom the book was, it came through his pen. The culture wrote the book. Basically, he's saying the structures of the culture, the systematic structures at work or at play, express themselves through this author, and therefore there really is no author to the book. Everything, as I think it was Edward Said said, is wall-to-wall text. And this had led to what I call the dictatorship. Actually, Pope Benedict, I stole his words, I'm sorry. He called it the dictatorship of relativism. And I'm just giving your listeners some of the background to how that came about. Probably some of the most notorious philosophers behind it, as I mentioned earlier, were Nietzsche himself and Heidegger, because and what they were both resisting really was Platonic tyranny, this idea that there's some kind of essentialism or essential reality hovering above us all, like index cards, and we can just pull it down and use them as a map to get through life. Jacques Derrida deplored all this as what he called the metaphysics of presence. And in his Johns Hopkins lecture, that phrase really stuck, because what he argued was that all these philosophers and systems builders were just trying to pour reality into something that would be present, that they could allude to, that would help them understand whatever problems came across the transom. So even structures, he said, now he's attacking structuralism in linguistics, is just another essentialist intellectual object, or a metaphor, in which, by means of which we impose order on a relative world. Plato's forms imposed order on the world, the natural law. These are what the critics are saying. The natural law imposed order on the world. The concept of God imposes order on the world. And again, this was all backed up in their minds by the idea that all signs are relative, which was wrong. It was a wrong interpretation of the linguistic theory. Okay, so, and by the way, I'm staying with the language again. People like Bertrand Russell, who was an interesting, very rationalist philosopher, he himself concluded that all this is quite wrong, that universals especially are everywhere in language. And I'll just read you something that he said in a little book that he wrote called The Problems of Philosophy. He said, when we examine common words, we find that, broadly speaking, proper names stand for particulars, while other substantives, adjectives, prepositions, and verbs stand for universals. And when we hear the sentence, Charles I's head was cut off, we may naturally enough think of Charles I, of Charles I's head, and of the operation of cutting off his head, which are all particulars. But we do not naturally dwell upon what is meant by the word head or the word cut, because these are universals. We don't have to dwell on them. We all know what they mean, was what Russell was getting at. And he said such words, without qualifications, are universals. Universal words without any particular context, he adds, are felt to be incomplete and insubstantial, demanding a context to make them particular. And hence, most people succeed in avoiding all notice of universals as such until the study of philosophy forces them upon our attention. He concludes that no sentence can be made up without at least one word that denotes a universal, and that nearly all the words to be found in the dictionary stand for universals. And of course, this is interesting in itself because a dictionary is one of the weapons that the relativists use to persuade millions of students that everything is relative. Because what they said was, look up any word in the dictionary and you'll see that it's defined with other words. In other words, a dictionary itself is just a huge self-referential object in which words are used to define other words. And that's why they came to the conclusion that it's wall-to-wall text and there's nothing outside the text. What's the term I'm looking for? We languageify everything. There's a certain truth to that, but as Russell pointed out, there's a certain untruth too. And I think the untruth is in the sense that there are universals, is more interesting. This brings me, by the way, to Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is probably one of the most cited scholars in the whole world in the 20th century. And I think politically he had some moronic views, but in language studies, he was some kind of genius at a very young age. At 27 years of age, he wrote a book called Syntactic Structures, in which he inserted it was about what he called generative or transformational grammars. He was kind of doing what Saussure was doing, but he went beyond Saussure to show how structures actually are part of language systems which generate meaning. And he spent almost his whole life trying to figure out how this works. He inserted a famous sentence in that book. Here's the sentence. He said, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. And he said, that's a nonsense sentence. It has no meaning. But every natural speaker of English would say it's perfectly grammatical. How can it be perfectly grammatical, he would ask, but be nonsensical? And the reason is that the structure that governs the performance of language is in fact a structure. It's not semantic, it's detached from meaning. And he argued that every human being carries around in his brain something he called UG, which means universal grammar. Whether or not he did not satisfy himself that he ever figured out how this works in the end, but he tried and tried again. And he was by the way, he was one of the greatest critics of his own theories, which became worldwide every time he modified them. They would take off and people would pick them up and say, wow, this is amazing. That guy's amazing. But then he would come out with a criticism of his own theory and try again to sophisticate it, time and again. I think in the end, he just kind of threw up his hands because he said, how do we explain that a 2-year-old child can produce a perfect, say, English sentence or whatever language you happen to speak? How can he produce a perfect English sentence that he's never heard before? In other words, if we base the idea on the fact that he couldn't have done that unless he had heard it or had the experience of hearing that sentence before. And then we would just say, oh, well, he memorized it, whatever, or he heard it enough that he memorized it. But children can produce completely novel sentences without ever having heard them before. And so the question you have to ask is, how do they do that? And the fact is, nobody knows. Nobody knows how they do that. Chomsky's idea was they can do it because they have a universal grammar, like some kind of machine in their brain that is making this possible. But we don't know yet how that works. We may never, and we can't take a brain out and take it apart and, figure it out. So we do it through psycholinguistic experiments, and we do it with PET scans and things like that, trying to get at it. But the long and short of it is, the reason that topic appears in a book called The Book of Absolutes is because that's an absolute. So if you happen to run into anybody who wants to make arguments about relativism, justifying them with language, you can tell them to forget it. They need to read Chomsky's book on syntactic structures and universal grammar, and also the work of a professor that I had at Stanford, whose name was Joseph Greenberg. Joseph Greenberg published a very thin little book called The Universals of Human Language, which was not structural or transformational like Chomsky's was, but he basically examined every language in the world, and there's over 5,000 of them or more, and he examined every one of them, and he extracted from them what he called the universals of human language, which are common to all people and all languages. And there's a lot of them in that little book. So once again, I guess I'm wrapping up now by way of saying that all these topics appear in the book: the biology, the physics, the anthropology, the cultural chapter, the chapter on language. They're all in this book, and the physics, I think I mentioned that, to explain to readers that, contrary to what we're hearing at parties like the cocktail party I told you about, that it's true for you, but it's not true for me, et cetera, et cetera. If you read this book, you will arm yourself to fight back against some of these ludicrous notions that something can be true and false at the same time.
Yes, I highly recommend the audience to get and buy the books of The War on the Family and the Book of Absolutes. This is an incredible work, and we appreciate what you did. Thank you so much, William.
Thank you.
Will you be willing to try to see if we have any questions? And
Sure, let's see if we do.
okay, Annalise, please go ahead. Annalise, Frank.
Hello there, William.
You have to increase your voice. Your sound is very low. Well, maybe we'll come back later. Any other questions, guys? Nunia, V, Rosie, anyone? Yeah, 1 second. Go ahead, V. V, you can go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. And thank you, William, for being on here. A question on the universal language, where you say children can construct a sentence when they haven't heard it before. Would that be telepathy, would you say, or would you like to comment on that, please?
Yeah, I don't know much about telepathy. I don't rule it out as a possibility, but no, I think there's, I have 16 grandchildren. I have a lot of experience listening to them talk from a very young age. And when they're running around in the garden playing, they come up with some of the most amazingly complex grammatical constructions. You sometimes using words for the first time, okay, which they must have heard or they couldn't have used them. What Chomsky was talking about, how familiar they are with the structures of the language. They get it right. Sometimes they get it wrong. And I don't know what language your native language is, but it's true that sometimes a child's logic will produce a variation of a word which is not common in the language. But that's just because the word as used in the language is not logical, but it's customary and traditional. For example, in English, we say there's one deer out there on the hill, or we say there are two deer, but we don't put the S on the end to indicate the plural. But a child may say, Grandpa, I saw two deers. So logic plays a role in all this to some extent. But in terms of the complexity of language grammar with subordinate clauses and all the rest of it that children master at 2 years of age or so, there's no explanation for how they can produce novel utterances. That's Chomsky's phrase, a novel utterance, without any experience of it. And, I would rule out telepathy myself, just because I can't believe billions of children in the world are speaking via telepathy.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that.
William, can you please describe to us or give us some examples to the most destructive aspect of relativism in today's society? Like, I think you understand my question.
The most destructive upset, you said?
What would be the examples for the destructive aspect of relativism in society? What is the damage that it's causing?
I mean, the war against the family goes into that at some length in the chapters on education, which maybe we'll get to eventually if we keep this going. As I say, if you still want to put up with me. But I think in the schools, relativism as taught in the schools is, to me, one of the most damaging facts of our time. And I say that because if you use relativist constructions like the guy did to me at the party, well, I'm an adult. I can tell him we both can't be right. One of us must be wrong. Why don't we talk about it? And he can either talk with me and learn something, or I can learn something, or he can go away. But a child, that's very different. You're talking about putty in the hands of the teacher. And a lot of teachers in Canada, and I think it's true throughout the world, it's certainly true in totalitarian countries, but it's no less true in so-called free societies where teachers consider themselves change agents. That's the phrase they use sometimes in Canada. They describe themselves as a change agent. They want to bring about change. And often that's moral change with respect to, feminism, which they're trying to ram down the throats of the children, with respect to things like free love, et cetera, et cetera. And the prototype for this, as I mentioned in one of our earlier discussions, was Sweden. The Swedes basically went public. I mean, you got to admire people who want to take your society apart and tell you first. That's a little more honest than just, dealing all the cards in the back room somewhere. The Swedes came up right up front and said, we want to take traditional society apart. And one of the ways we're going to do that is we're going to de-emphasize the role of sex in human life, and therefore the role of gender. Now, at the time, they didn't make a distinction between sex and gender, and many people still don't. But what they basically did was, we got to start with the kids in the schools. We have to teach them that we have more reliable information about sex than their parents do. And of course, that was very easy. It was very easy for them to get the allegiance of the children because suppose a 13, I don't know, I'm not going to say 12 or 14-year-old girl tells her teacher, in confidence, I have sexual feelings, teacher. And, mom would say, well, that's natural. Basically, you're going to have to live with it until you're older or until you get married or some traditional thing like that. But the teacher may say, you have sexual feelings. Well, isn't that interesting? I can remember that myself. And, if you feel ready, that's something to which you should feel free to give expression. You have a boyfriend, right? Yes, I do. Well, about my mom and dad, they would think that's terrible. Well, they're a little bit old fashioned and that's the way people used to think. But today what we think is, this kind of conversation would take place. And if you need some contraception, we are authorized by the law in Sweden to write you a prescription. We can do that. What if my mother found out? You don't have to tell your mother. Anyway, you see what I'm getting at. You can believe that after a few minutes, that student just loves that teacher and thinks that teacher is more credible than old-fashioned mommy and daddy. And that's how the Swedes set about in the schools, principally changing sexual consciousness in Sweden, which led to a change in the entire society, a change in the roles of the husband and the wife at home. And then, of course, that got into the economic realm where they basically said, we think all women should be like all men. They should be independent earners of income, able to support themselves, not dependent upon anyone else, male or female, to make their own living. And so they changed everything, the tax structure and the social expectations surrounding women's work, which at the time, of course, were much as they were when I grew up, that a mother's role in particular, not a woman's necessarily, but a mother's role was to raise her own children and not to put them in the hands of strangers who are going to treat them like every other child. When in fact, when my children are at my home, I don't treat them like every other child. They're very special. They're much more special than any other child could possibly be to me. I mean, that's what you do with your child. That's what I do with mine. And so in other words, here were social engineers using sexual training in the schools of a very relativistic nature because they were basically dismissing parental authority and traditional sexual teachings and relativizing sex to the extent that the meaning of sexual behavior is up to you. It's no longer up to your society, no longer up to your church, no longer up to your family or your parents. It's just up to you and your feelings. So I went on a bit long there, but you get the gist of let's call it the psychomechanics of this way of undermining the moral traditions of an entire society. And as I say, the Swedes were very forthright about it. They said, that's what we're going to do. We're going to de-emphasize the role of sex in human life. And by the way, that carried through everything. The Swedes stopped using the term divorce entirely. They talk about, get this, couple dissolution, not divorce. Divorce implies some kind of future bond or commitment to the future. No, couple dissolution is the term we're going to use. And couples dissolve whether they're married or not, common law or not. Why do we care? So you get the picture. I don't know if it's happening in your society, but it's certainly been happening in ours in a less militaristic way than it took place in Sweden, fortunately.
Yeah, it's happening here as well. Rosie, do you have a question or a comment?
I have a question. So, from what I'm hearing, would you equate relativism with Bolshevism, communism, liberalism, whatever opposite ism you you want.
Yes. Two comments on that, perhaps. When people use the word liberalism today, I always have to ask them what they mean, and most of them don't know. So I'll just chime in here because I think we're running out of time a bit. Classical liberalism had to do with individual liberty in the context of, in a community context, social context, property rights context, and all that. So classical liberalism was a good thing, in my point of view. But over time, it deteriorated when people who created societies built on that classical liberal foundation found out that there was, because, as I say, liberty was the heart of it, foundation and liberty, found out that in fact it was producing some bad results. What kind of bad results? Well, it produced poverty, for one thing. Suddenly, America, say, had an underclass, which began in the mid-19th century. England had the beacon of liberty. England had an underclass in the 18th and 19th centuries, which was quite prominent. In fact, that became one of the stimuli for Marx and Engels when he wrote his Communist Manifesto. Engels wrote a book condemning the idea of private property, condemning the idea of the natural family, and wanting to bring about a communistic society in which everybody would have equal outcomes and be equally free. But more to your question, I think, was about where relativism fit into this. I think relativism is one of the philosophical and moral instruments that these builders of these so-called perfect societies use to try to persuade the people that their system will make everyone equal and better off. That's for sure. Because if you can relativize all moral values, you basically disempower the ability of that value to shape society. And by the way, if you want to see a warning, go to my website right now. It's got a page and a half or two post on it called, the title of it is Vladimir Putin Was Right, or whatever. I forget the title, but that's about it. It's about Vladimir Putin, who most people are a little bit suspicious of, but he came out with a public statement at a conference a short while ago in which he said, you folks in the West, watch out. We've done this before. We did all this relativism. We did all this anti-family stuff. We did all this communism, and so on. And you do what you want, okay? Do what you want. But I'm warning you, he said, about where it's going to lead. So maybe you should think twice. Anyway, I recommend your listeners here to have a read of that blog to see what Vladimir Putin says about what most of us are now doing.
Thank you very much, William. So I guess we will. I mean, do you want to allow another question, or should we?
If you have one, let's do one more, and then we'll wrap up. Is that okay?
Yes, of course. Let's see if we have another one. Guys, any other questions, please? Please raise your hand if you do. No, just on time. So we can let you go. So next Wednesday, we are going to see you again and back to the war on the family. If
Yes,
that's
sir.
okay with you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate joining your group.
We appreciate that. That's a delight for us.
Am I too late to ask a question, William? Sorry.
Go ahead.
Hi, yeah. Thanks very much. I'm very sad that I missed most of your talk and came in at about 20 minutes towards the end, 30 minutes towards the end. Thank you for doing all that hard work and studying and being able to recant so many great facts. And I don't really have a question. I just wanted to gloat a bit about hearing your wonderful words. And yeah, I guess I wanted to know, you know, you've obviously spent decades and decades concerned with a variety of things surrounding these things. What would you say all of that study and all of that learning and all of your life experience, what has that brought you to now in terms of how to survive this current climate? I mean, obviously you're in Canada, right? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you're obviously facing some pretty hard-edged front lines with the COVID thing. And how are you feeling about it all? And how do you think that the normal person could utilize what you've been studying and learning about?
Well, thanks for the question. At my age, it's a question I ask myself. Like, was it worth it?
Yeah.
All what I have done.
Mm.
Well, I guess the fact that at age 81, I'm here chatting with you, that makes it worth it to me. And I've always said when I give public talks, you never know who's in the audience. I would give a public talk even if only one person showed up, because you never know who that person is and what they're going to do when they start thinking about what you've been saying.
That's right.
But back to your original question, I am a bit discouraged in the sense that it's been like a tsunami washing over all the nations of the West. So when people say to me, how do you feel about having been a traditional conservative writer and thinker for the last 35 years? Here's what I say. I say, I feel like a man who's been standing on a rock in a leftward drifting sea. And in the distance, I see ships drifting to the left. And I hear voices. And one of those voices is saying, look, look, there's a man out there drifting to the right. That's what's happened. I am described in Canada as a so-called far right thinker, when in a head-to-head debate with anybody calling me that, I could easily persuade them that all of my books and all of my thoughts are just good, solid, traditional conservative thinking, which are rooted in a tradition which we have unfortunately been forgetting very rapidly. There's nothing far right about it, by which they mean extremist, which only tells you they have drifted farther to the left so far that they don't even understand where their own ideas.
Well, yeah, they're drifted so far left that they don't even know that center is actually center anymore. It looks far away, you know. So it's like,
that's right. So you know, somebody calls me far right, I say, why don't you call the other guys far left? That's what they are, but let's balance the slurs a bit, you know.
I mean, it would be fair to argue that a lot of the destruction and unpleasant stuff of the last centuries or two has come out of this left space. I mean, because I always thought I considered myself liberal, or you know, kind of humanist, really, just living by what is right and wrong, you know, using my reason to rationalize what is right and wrong, and that was the only real theory I could ever come up with. The left and right politics things I just see as a very much as a game, as a divisive tool, you know. So I often let's say I'm very intrigued by how to break down the left-right political game, because it does feel like, you know, we say, well, conservatism is right and liberalism is left, but as we all know, those words now mean very different or varied things.
Well, if I could, I'm going to recommend another book of mine to you, because in 2015, I published a book called The Great Divide. And that book has 14 short chapters in it. At the end of each chapter, there's a kind of graph, which gives you in the form of a comparative list the fundamental features of the left and the right when it comes to any of those 14 chapters, the issues in those chapters. And so for the first time, really, I have to say the first time, because it's been tried before in a limited way, but I don't think anyone else has ever written a book in which a reader who wants to know where they stand could read a chapter and examine their own attitudes at the end on these graphs and compare them to the left if they're a conservative, or to the right if they're a modern liberal.
Great.
So I encourage you to go to that book.
I'm there. I'm on your website now. I'm looking at it. Great.
Yeah, get some surprises.
There's some good books there by the looks of it too. So yeah, I just bought one which is very much on the same subject of increasing sort of Marxist doctrine and neo-Marxism, and all of what we see going on politically. A lot of what Jordan Peterson talks about too, who I'm sure you've come across, being a local to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was the first character who really made a lot of sense in some interesting ways at the age of 40. He sort of
Yeah, well, he and I are on the same page, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'd say so.
In fact, the last time I shook hands with him, he said he had The Great Divide on his desk and was ready to read it. So,
no time.
Yeah.
Well, it's lovely talking to you. Thank you for letting me just sort of talk rubbish at you for a brief moment and ask questions.
Thank
And
you.
take care. I might drop you an email just to have a further chat, because there's some interesting.
Thank you very much.
I was totally not prepared to hear you speak tonight, but I wish I had been, because I'd have. I'm sure I would.
Well, it'll be online. You can hear the whole thing if you want.
Yeah, great. I will check it out. I'll get with Woven Art and see.
Yeah, Frank, we have the previous recordings of every event on our groups, and we also have a YouTube channel that belongs to William. I'm going to post the link as soon as possible.
Lovely. I'm rather hopeless at finding those archives on Telegram, but I'll make an extra effort.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You'll find them on my website.
Oh, okay, cool.
Okay, William, thank you again. Thank you very much all the time. You are a bright young man.
Enjoy meeting with you this way. Thank you.
Okay, so see you next week, and God bless you.
You too. Bye.
Take care.
Bye. Guys, I'm going to open the floor for free conversation if you are interested.
Great. Well, thanks. How long have you been